Welcome to episode 3467 of the Planet of the Associations. I hope you've been keeping up with us. Make sure that you've received the last 3464 episodes. If you were watching episode 3 last time, you missed a lot, but we will bring you back to one point, which is how did we create the name Planet of the Associations? In just a moment. First, I want to remind you what Planet of the Associations is all about. Mark, can you tell us?
Yeah. So Planet of Associations, what this is for predominantly C-level officers in associations. And by the way, C-level, it's not that everyone can listen, obviously, but Seth and I are normally used to working with C-level. So we kind of want to talk about things that we understand best. We don't want to talk about things, pretend that we don't, like, oh yeah, I know about that. We don't. So it's predominantly for C-level officers, and it's about how to create the association of the future and not the association of the distant future, more the association 3 years from whenever you are, right? It's X plus 3, right? So the association of X plus 3. And we're going to be talking about ideas about that standard stuff that you'd expect about how to create membership, how, creating value for membership and so forth. But we also have this idea of indirection as being very important, that in order to get to something new and interesting, it is essential. It's not a nicety. It is absolutely essential that you get far off track of what it is you're doing, and you bring back ideas from that distant place to where you are, and you see, do these ideas work here? So we're going to be talking about things like science and math and magic and things that seem distant, but they're really not. There's a method to our madness.
And so far, we've talked about the Schlitz Brewery. We've talked about underground fires in Pennsylvania. I mean, we are really covering a lot of ground here, but we're bringing it back to help you run a better organization, lead a better organization, and chart your course into the future. To do that, we created this show, which has a name that's drawn from the past, which is kind of strange, but it was a futuristic past, right? It was something that happened in the past about something that happened way in the future. How did we come up with the name Planet of the Associations?
Right. So Seth and I decided that we want, by the way, so Seth's an expert with associations. I'm a differentiation expert, but we'd worked together before, and we just wanted to create, we wanted to do something important for associations. You guys have so much power and ability and have such an ability to change the world that we said, we want to help them do that. So we decided, because of our wackiness, along with our business thinking, we wanted our branding and the ideas to reflect that. So the first thing, and this is important with coming up with ideas. So I sat down, and just to come up with the idea of the podcast, what I did was I decided we need to come up with lots of names. Right. So it's the idea. Remember, in an earlier episode, I talked about elevator speeches, and you need dozens of elevator speeches. That you find elevator speeches difficult because you think you're only supposed to have one, and that's what's making it difficult. If you had dozens, it's the simplest thing in the world. So it's the same way. It's 100 ideas are easier than one idea. It is much easier to come up with 100 ideas than one idea. So what I did was I sat down and I just started. I thought of Seth and I have a background in magic. He has a background in street theater and things of that nature. So I just started being playful with that. And I started to write down one after another names that had to do with 1950s and 60s and 70s horror films, science fiction films, all with association in the title. And one of them, I thought, I love Planet of the Apes. So Planet of the Associations. And I didn't stop on it. I just kept on writing. So I had this list of several dozen names. And then Seth and I jumped on a Zoom call, and I started reading these names to him. And I saw him viscerally react when I said Planet, right, of the associations. He had this jump that he did. So even without knowing what it was he was going to say, I knew what he was going to say, because you could just see from his reaction, right? Is that how
that's it.
Decided to create everything around that? But the idea for you listening the reason why Seth said, "Oh, let's tell him why we created Plan the Associations." So it was organic to who we are. It signals to you that yes, we're going to talk about associations, but we're going to be playful about it. And then also, it's this idea of we could never have come up with Planet of Associations if we had headed directly to the idea. If we did that, it would have been called the Associations Podcast.
Right.
Or so that's,
Yeah,
you need to leave the track, and 100 ideas is better than one. You get into a certain space and you think from that space. I remember someone saying to me once, I forget. I think I was working with a magician, or they were asking me about a magician who I'd been working with to create something, and they said, "It's amazing that he could come up with such wild ideas," is what they said to me. And I said, "It's not amazing at all." And I said, "He takes his mind and he puts it into a wild place." So he's in a wild place and he just writes down what he sees from that wild place. And he's got all these wild ideas, and they're very ordinary ideas within this extraordinary wild area. Right. And that's how you create interesting ideas for your association, for your speeches, for your culture, for anything. You got to get to that wild place or that innovative place or whatever the place is you want to say. And from there, it's almost like now it's just an Audubon guide to birds. You just, okay, I'm in this wild situation. What do I see here? And you write it down.
Yeah, yeah. And going to that wild place, so many amazing things can happen. So thank you for that. One of the things that it reminded me of was a time when I was working with a CEO on helping to gel his senior team. His senior team was filled with people who were really powerful, forceful, aggressive, creative, generative, and they were all individuals. They had not come together as a team. Each one of them was a force, and he was really having trouble with kind of pulling them together and creating that connective tissue so that they could hit a level of synergy that they just weren't quite getting. So we designed a retreat together, and this is what we did. First of all, we engaged the senior team in the development of the retreat, right? So that they knew what the game plan was. When they show up, there's not going to be any surprises. They were all involved, but it was very light, and you'll see why in just a moment. So we just did like 1 or 2 sessions with them in advance where they got their input. And then as we were driving to the retreat center, we dropped some hints that, this was going to be, a special retreat, that something extraordinary was going to happen. But we just seeded the conversation with it, kind of like when you're watching a movie and there's a couple of clues early on in the movie that you don't really understand until the movie's over. So you go back and watch the beginning again, that's what
foreshadowing.
Foreshadowing, yeah. So we get everybody together. We're off site. It's a place that has no internet access, which is actually very important to what we were going to do. But of course, everybody's complaining. Oh, I can't check my email. I don't know what's going on in the world, So we get them together in a room and we start this very ordinary retreat, very straight. It begins the way many retreats do. And while we're going, this person who works on staff at the resort we hired, they come in, look kind of worried, concerned. They come over and they whisper in the ear of the CEO, and his whole facial expression changes, like, oh my God. And he like runs out of the room, right? And he comes back like 15 minutes later and everybody's wondering like, what happened? What's going on? What's happening? And he says, Congress just passed a law making our organization no longer tax exempt. Our organization, they've come after the 501Cs. We got hit. Starting in 3 months, we are no longer tax exempt. This is like a major game changer for everything. We've got to figure out how we're going to survive. And then for the next 48 hours, his team worked through the night, redesigning the entire business process so that they could be, fun, work. The business model would work in an environment where they were no longer tax exempt. And that was the team building exercise. Of course, this was all made up. So we had to let them down gently towards the end because people were, get a tendency to get a bit upset. I mean, people worked through the night, 2 nights in a row, so they were like bleary eyed and everything, but they were a team. When it was over, they had gelled as a group. And that's an example of going to that wild place, right? The stuff that they did those 2 days and nights together was ordinary stuff when it comes to really working tightly together as a team. But we had to get them into the space where that was a requirement, where it was a survival issue. Once we were there, then the bonds were built, the connective tissue formed, people were doing all kinds of amazing things in subsets of 2 and 3. And when it was over, they had a unique experience that nobody else in the world had that they could go back and refer to and say, that's when we came together.
Right. I once did a talk at Entrepreneurs Organization years ago, and I I the guy who was hosting me, right, the MC of my event. It was a big workshop. He came out before I came out, and he said, "Hi, we're here. Our speaker is Mark Levy, and Mark's going to tell us about how to differentiate, how to create this killer brand that it stops everyone in their tracks and so forth. Now, you have to understand," this is what the guy said to the group. "You have to understand, I had a hard time convincing the hierarchy here to allow Mark to speak. And that's because some of the methodologies that he teaches people, people sometimes find a bit offensive or a bit dangerous. It's not conventional stuff, and it's a little controversial, the stuff he does. So, but I told them, I said, look, if we want to thrive as business owners, this is the kind of stuff that we need to see. We shouldn't turn away from this kind of thing. So, ladies and gentlemen, please help me introduce Mark Levy, thank Mark. And so I come out and everyone's like looking around, saying, what the hell is happening? And I said, you know what? Thank you so much for that introduction. I have a talk prepared I want to talk to you about, but I didn't expect that. But I'm always interested in what's happening around me. And I see a bunch of you guys are freaking out. Always my thing.
That's a theme.
Right. Exactly. So I'm really interested. You heard I'm this dangerous consultant when it comes to differentiation. And so I'm really interested. What do you think I'm going to say? Like what kinds of dangerous biz dev and differentiation techniques are out there? I mean, I don't really think of what I do as dangerous, but I guess some people do. So I'm interested to know, what do you think I'm going to say to you? So what I want you to do is turn to your partner. I'm going to give you like 3 minutes. And I want you what are the things this nut job? Again, I don't think I'm dangerous, but they do. So what do you think? And so they talked. And then I said, okay, let's hear from some of you. What do you think Mr. Danger is going to say here? And they started telling me these really interesting far out strategies. And then at the end of that, I said, okay, so here's what you need to know is that this was planned. Yes, the ideas that I'm going to talk about are unusual. That's how I approach things. That's how I approach life. They're unusual, but they're in no way dangerous. As a matter of fact, approaching things the way you normally do is what's dangerous. So, if we were to do a straight ahead gig here, that's the most dangerous thing I could possibly do. But know that I'm not going to advise you on things that are going to get you sued, that are going to get you none of this stuff. But it was just to help you open up your thinking. And the reason why we did it this way is because I coach people on innovating and differentiating, and I find that they're often reticent to open up their thinking, that unless they're forced, kicking and screaming with their backs against the walls into a new situation, they will go back to what has worked for them in the past over and over and over and over again. That it's human nature. This is not me saying some ethical thing or whatnot, or about people's intelligence. That's just how people are. So I very much, I coined a term, I think in Accidental Genius, one of my books, the idea of forced creativity. That is, you create an exercise that just has one tiny rule involved in it. And as long as you follow that rule, you are forced to think anew. You have absolutely no option, because getting people, asking them to think differently is not good. It's not going to work. That is not a tactical way to approach anything. You've got to really force them into thinking something new. So you talked about being at this, where was this, by the way, New Mexico or someplace?
No, it was local. It was in the DC area, but we had a retreat center that was, out in the boonies. It was in Virginia.
Oh, okay. Gotcha. So you did this thing out in Virginia, and I'm talking about this thing that I did for EO, but it was really tricking. So in your situation, you talked about it was nonprofits, now they had to make a profit. That's very interesting because often if I'm working with for-profits, I say to them, okay, tell me about your organization, but tell me about it as if it was a nonprofit. Because I find a friend of mine once, Michael Katz, wrote about this. I loved what he wrote. Like, he found that he said, when I speak to nonprofits, they can talk about their mission endlessly because their mission is why they're there. Like, we're here to help adults with illiteracy become readers so that they can get better jobs or whatnot. Like, that's just so easy for them to do. He said, but when I speak to for-profit people and I ask them about what it is they do, they instantly start talking about their business model.
Right.
Like, it's essentially, here's what I do to make money.
Right.
Whereas with a nonprofit, you would never get that from a nonprofit. Do you find that schism? Go ahead.
Well, just one thing to be clear. So nonprofits can make a profit. It's just that the tax structure changes. And there's so much that they don't have to pay taxes on. And if they're counting on that to make their margin, now they're in deep yogurt. Right. So yeah, but it is true. Nonprofits are much more mission oriented. Most of them, not all of them, but most of them are, and they can talk about their mission. And in fact, many nonprofits will engage in activities where they lose money intentionally because there's some other activity where they can make it up. And the reason that, and most for-profits would never pick up a major activity that was a known money loss, or they would not continue something. But it's kind of like a loss leader, except that it's driven by the mission. Sometimes there are things that you must do in order to accomplish the mission that are not going to have a margin to them, and you do them anyways, and you subsidize it through other activity.
What would be an example of that?
Well, I know associations that run their annual conference where they break even and they have to put all this energy into it. I say they break even financially, but in terms of the staff time and energy, they're running it, in the red, right? Because there's no money coming back in it. But without that conference, they're not able to do other things. And so they go ahead and put on the conference. That's an example.
What's another idea, what I call forced creativity? What's another idea that a nonprofit, an exercise that would, as long as they follow this rule of this exercise or so, they're going to generate new thinking about something important to them, whether they want to or not?
Well, there's so many exercises like that because what you've just identified is the structure of a particular type of exercise that's designed to put people's backs creatively against the wall. So here's one. I will bring, and I've done this often with boards and senior teams. I will tell them that I want you to imagine that you're in a garage in Silicon Valley and you're working with another person. You've got an infinite supply of money because your investors think you're golden, and your job is to take out your current organization, to eat the lunch of the association that you work for now. And so first thing I want you to do is I want you to identify all of the vulnerabilities. Like, for example, we have a board of directors that has to approve all major financial decisions, and they do that very slowly. And we have to convince and get consensus, whereas the two guys in the garage in Silicon Valley can do anything they want, and they can do it now, literally now, right? Let's send an email to 10,000 people. How long will that take us? About 5 minutes. Let's do it, right? So it's like, that's an example of a vulnerability. But then I drive them to get in deeper, like management style, relationship with the members, product and service portfolio, understanding the value proposition to new people in your field. What are the vulnerabilities that you feel like your organization really exhibits? And how would these two guys in a garage in Silicon Valley exploit those so that they could take your members away? And I want you to live in the heads of the two guys. When I do this exercise, by the way, I will often break the group up into subsets because people will come up with very different strategies, and it's important to hear as many of them as you can. Initially, it's challenging to do an exercise like this because it's almost a taboo to talk about your own organization's vulnerabilities. Maybe not all of them, but some of them. For example, what if your organization has poor leadership? What if the leaders are unable to make decisions that they stick to? That can be really challenging for a group to say, and here's one of our vulnerabilities. So oftentimes there's a pre-exercise that allows them to identify these things without attribution. Then we break them up into the subgroups, and then you push them hard to say, how are you going to eat the lunch? How are you going to take the members away? What are you going to do? So that's an example.
Yeah. Well, that reminds me something from my background. Uh, I'll lead these brainstorms. I used to lead brainstorms for Mad Men, right, on Madison Avenue, and did it a few times. And one thing, the way I would often start, not always, but I found this to be very valuable, is that I found that there were parts of a situation that people didn't want to approach because the parts scared them. And I think that certain parts of a situation scare us because we don't know if we can find an answer to it. So, in other words, it's like an ostrich situation, even though I know ostriches don't really do this in this way, but it's sticking our head in the sand. It's not looking at something because we don't know if we're capable of handling it or finding an answer. So if we encounter something that we can't answer, now we're stuck. Right. It's like, oh my God, I'm less than I thought I was, or we're less than we thought, and it's irreparable. Like we're doomed. And so what I would do in order to counter that is I would begin by saying, okay, we're here to come up with a great idea for X, for like this campaign, or if you're listening with associations, for your association, on your marketing, on your biz dev, on whatever it is you're doing, on your mission. Like, we're here to do that. And instead of starting off with new ideas, because if you had the right idea, we wouldn't even be meeting right now. So like, I'm assuming that we don't have the right idea yet, or we're not convinced that an idea that we do have is the right idea, whether it is or not. So why don't we first begin by, instead of brainstorming good ideas, let's first brainstorm questions. And as a matter of fact, I want to begin by brainstorming every possible question that we could possibly think of about every single part of the situation that we can. So brainstorm questions about the product we're studying, or the service that we're studying, or our organization, or about like our ability to sell it, or what our marketing materials are for it, or who our client is, or what society is doing now, or whatnot. Just questions. They can be big, giant questions from 30,000 feet, but they could be the smallest tactical question, like, feet on the ground question you've ever heard of. We're going to take 10 minutes to brainstorm every possible question. And as a matter of fact, we're not going to write any of them down. I'm not, because by the way, when I first did that, I tried to have someone write them down, and that it became like useless busy work. There was no reason to do that. I said, you're just going to say these things aloud. You don't have to raise your hand, just say them aloud. And if you hear a question or two or three or four that lights you up, write it down, but you don't have to. You can end the whole 10 minutes without any questions down. But what it is we're just doing is, I want us to start thinking about the situation in its totality. I don't want any blind spots interfering with what we're doing. So you're not going to have to come up with answers to any of these questions, but I want to hear the question, even about the things you fear most or hope for most. And I do that to this day. Sometimes if I'm working on a project, if I'm free writing, if I'm journaling about a project, thinking about it, I'll often just take a session and write down every question I can think of, right? Because it gets me, having to cover things up creates fear in you, like it creates confinement. So I'd rather say, oh, okay, what do I know? What do I think I know?
Right.
What do I really don't know? And I put that, knowing that I don't have to solve any of those things.
Right.
It's just getting the mind thinking. Does that make sense?
Yeah, sure. And it's about liberating people. I mean, I think of facilitation as liberating the intelligence that's in the room, right? We all have so much deep expertise and experience, but it gets held in. People are defensive, or they're not sure, or like you said, they're scared. They don't want to throw something out because what if it represents something that's unsolvable, that dooms the organization, or they don't see a path forward. There's so many limitations that we place on ourselves, and that when we need to go into that creative space, that really inhibits what's possible. And as leaders, it inhibits the responses that we have. One of the things that I've noticed from working with really top-notch leaders, and I've had the opportunity to work with, Jim Wolfenson, president of the World Bank, or Gadi Vasquez, director of the Peace Corps, senior leaders at Royal Dutch Shell, many over 100 CEOs in the association world, is that really good leaders will draw on any life experience that's relevant to what they're doing. They could have had a conversation over a bowl of cereal with a 3-year-old, and if it will help them with their strategic plan, they don't hesitate. Boom, it's in the conversation. But one of the things that you often see from people who are not yet comfortable in their leadership role is that they confine themselves to their title. If I'm the CFO, I can only talk about finance. If I'm the chief strategy officer, I can only talk strategy, right? Really good leaders grab anything that works. They'll take it no matter where it comes from and put it to use.
Right. I love that. I mean, yeah, it reminds me, I was once speaking to a room full of CFOs, an enormous company, and they had a mandate from the CEO that they wanted the CFOs to have more of a leadership role. Like, rather than just looking at what had happened, like the checks and balances, the credits and debits, like, what is it, using your amazing knowledge, CFOs, what can we do that we're not doing? And I got to tell you that there was resistance, even though we talked about, like, look, here's what the CEO did. It's this mandate, like, he wants you to step up, all this stuff. Like, they didn't know what stepping up in their role looked like. At least this room that I was talking about. I'm not saying CFOs in general. I'm just saying they didn't know. In your mind, like, for a CFO, what would stepping up look like? I'm just interested.
For a CEO or CFO? CFO. Actually, I've got one in mind. There's a particular gentleman I know, Kevin Madden. I'm going to call him out right here. He's one of the best CFOs I've ever worked with. Kevin is extraordinary at not just analyzing the numbers, but then creating models that he can use to take the entire organization forward strategically. He's also very good at explaining. I can't tell you how many presentations I've sat through with CFOs where they'll put a bunch of numbers up on a wall and they say, clearly we see that. No, I don't have decades of experience analyzing numbers. I don't have the same degree you have. I don't have the same perception of this organization. I don't have the history that you have. No, it's not clearly I see that. I don't see it clearly. The really good ones will explain it. They'll tell you, what's the context? Why do these numbers matter? What are the trends? What are the patterns? How do I interpret what it is that I'm seeing right now? And that's exactly what Mr. Madden does when he's talking to a group of senior team. I've had the chance to work with him several times side by side, but it's these amazing models that he would develop. And that to me is that's the stepping up, because when you put together a model that's built on solid financial understanding, right, as well as projections about the future with various risk mitigation strategies and risk analysis, that model makes it possible for many leaders to act in concert around bringing into existence a particular future. And that's an extraordinary power. Those CFOs who have that communication ability and that ability to conceive of conceptual models really can bring that to the table in terms of stepping up in leadership.
So I love what you said. It's the idea of looking ahead, but basing it on some facts, like in the present. So you don't have to feel like, oh my God, I'm making up science fiction. I'm not like inventing a whole new universe. It's what they consider thought leadership. Thought leadership is, here's what's happening today, and here are the implications for you.
That's correct.
So it's all like, here's what is, and here are the implications, and let's follow those implications out to some unusual places. That's what it sounds like you're saying.
Right. And we want some of those unusual places to be extraordinary success, right? That's where we want to go. So with that, thank you for listening to this episode, and we'll see you next time on Planet of the Associations.